Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hill, Mr. Holmes, thank you for your testimony. Dr. Hill, you made a fairly dramatic comment in your opening statement to which the ranking member took some exception. I'm more interested in the Ukraine piece of this, but you said some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country and that perhaps somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. I'm really much more interested in the Ukraine piece of this, but I do want to defend you briefly. I don't know what my colleagues believe, but I do have a pretty good sense of what the effects are of creating ambiguity, of lacking clarity and conviction around the Russian attack on the election of 2016. In response to your comment, the ranking member offered up a report which varies in material respects from the report that was created by the 17 agencies of the intelligence community. A day does not go by in which ranking member Nunes does not speak of the Russia hoax. And this is an area in which context is pretty important. Dr. Hill, let me read you a comment by another senior official. Why did Democratic National Committee turn down the DHS offer to protect against hacks? It's all a big Dem hoax, all caps. Why did the DNC refuse to turn over its server to the FBI? It's all a big Dem scam. Dr. Hill, do you know who said those things?
I don't.
That's the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. So you might be forgiven for your...
that.
Yeah, you didn't miss much. But my point is, and tell me if you agree or disagree, ambiguity, a failure to name and shame the Russians for the attack in 2016, that is not in the service of our national security, is it?
It's not, no.
It's not. So let's turn to Ukraine. Dr. Hill, have you seen you characterized the idea that Ukraine interfered in the election as a fictional narrative. Have you seen any evidence at all that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election?
Well, I brought with me two exhibits that I was pointed to, in fact, by our colleagues during the deposition that I gave on October 14th. And actually, I'm quite grateful that they pointed me in this direction. I was presented during my deposition with two articles, or at least two pieces of information. One was an op-ed that the Ukrainian ambassador Charlie wrote in 2016 in The Hill. So this is during the presidential campaign when President Trump was then the nominee for the Republican Party. And this is Ambassador Charlie, who was then, still the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, being critical of President Trump, who was then the nominee for the Republican Party, for making comments about Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia.
May I interrupt you there? Let me be very specific about what those comments were. The president, when he was a candidate, said, quote, "The people of Crimea, from what I've heard, would rather be with Russia than where they were." So Ambassador Charlie is responding to that in that article, correct?
That's correct, and he just uses this as a peg because, to be honest, the whole article is actually about Ukraine. And this is classic standard for anyone who wants to write an op-ed. I've written plenty of them myself. You pick a peg by something that you or somebody else might have said, and then you proceed to say what you want to say.
Right, so here it is.
What Ambassador Charlie does is he talks about Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Russia and Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Yeah, and let me just read, because it's worth people hearing what this severe attack on candidate Trump, who has suggested that the Crimeans would rather be with Russia. Ambassador Charlie writes, "Even if Trump's comments are only speculative and do not really reflect a future foreign policy, they call for appeasement of an aggressor and support the violation of a sovereign country's territorial integrity and another's breach of international law." Dun, dun, dun. That's the attack on candidate Trump. Does that sound like election interference to you?
Well, I would say that it's probably not the most advisable thing to do for an ambassador because you never know who's going to win. And I think that the second piece that was presented to me at great length, and I want to thank Mr. Castor for making me go back and read it again, because when you asked me the questions about it, I did remember the piece. Kenneth Vogel is a very well-known and, as you've pointed out, extremely good journalist. And I'd remembered reading this back in the day in January of 2017, but it had been a long time between then and October. And you gave me a copy, and I went back and read it again, because I think it actually is extraordinarily important. It gets to this issue here. Mr. Vogel points out that the Ukrainian government, again, they wouldn't have done very well at the bookies, picking up the issue I pointed out at the beginning of today, they bet on the wrong horse. They bet on Hillary Clinton winning the election. And so, they were trying to curry favour with the Clinton campaign. It's quite evident here. And he relates, to some extent, individuals and some Ukrainian officials, like Mr. Avakov, the Interior Minister, and a number of other people that he names here and that have been named at various points, and talks about how they were trying to collect information, as Ranking Member Nunes said, on Mr. Manafort and on other people as well. However, I do want to point out that the crux of the article here by Mr. Vogel is he said there was little evidence of a top-down effort by Ukraine. And he makes a distinction between the Russian effort that was personally directed by Russian President Putin and involved the country's military and foreign intelligence services. Now, I don't think that those two things are exactly the same. I also mentioned in my deposition of October 14th that, in fact, many officials from many countries, including Ukraine, bet on the wrong horse. They believed that Secretary Clinton, former Senator Clinton, former First Lady Clinton was going to win. And many said some pretty disparaging and hurtful things about President Trump, and I can't blame him for feeling aggrieved about them. And when we were setting up head of state visits, and I remember I have a portfolio of 50-plus countries, plus NATO and the European Union, we thought it prudent to collect as much as possible about comments that people might have said about the president during the campaign when he was either one of the candidates to be the nominee for the Republican Party, or when he was actually the candidate running against Hillary Clinton. And I'm sorry to say that an awful lot, and perhaps I shouldn't name them here because it will have consequences, an awful lot of senior officials in many governments, including our allied governments, said some pretty hurtful things about the president. And I would also personally take offence at some of the things that were said if I were the president. Now, the difference here, however, is that that hasn't had any major impact on his feelings towards those countries. Not that I have seen. But I've also heard the president say, and he said it in public, so I'm not revealing any kind of executive privilege here, that Ukraine tried to take me down. What I have seen is some ill-advised Ukrainian officials, Ambassador Charlie's been removed as being the ambassador from here, made some pretty, unpleasant statements about, or some ill-advised op-eds. But I could list a whole host of ambassadors from allied countries who tweeted out, who had public comments about the president as well, and it did not affect security assistants having meetings with them. If it would, there'd been a lot of people he wouldn't have met with.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to add to the record a Politico article of December 1st, 2016, entitled "Russia Accuses Ukraine of Sabotaging Trump." It outlines Russian senior officials making allegations that there was Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election.